rumble a little bit and have some fun when we talk about transaction readiness. And so I just want to thank the Rocky Mountain Total Rewards Association for sponsoring this discussion on transaction readiness on the sell side. Like I said, I'm Jason Walker from Thrive HR Consulting. We're a full service HR consulting firm. We also do a lot of work in the mergers and acquisition space, and we're really happy to be here. And my co-host today is David Lawlor. David, you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, David Lawlor, a HR practitioner, both on the corporate side as well as a consultant. Began my career with a focus in compensation and HRIS in a very acquisitive, large global financial services firm. Spent about 2/3 of my career growing through acquisition, growing businesses. The final third of that stint really was focused on divestitures. So what we're talking about today, I spent about 7 years carving out, standing up and selling off pieces of that business. I then moved into consulting for several years, and so I've worked with clients on acquisitions and divestitures, and look forward to sharing some of that experience with you today. Thank you.
And some of my personal experience was working in Cisco systems in the heyday of acquisitions when Cisco was just acquiring more companies than any other company was at that time, and doing it at light speed. And then doing acquisitions for Polycom and BMC Software, and now working on acquisitions and integrations and divestitures for our own company, Thrive HR Consulting, as we help our clients work through the processes. So we're super happy you're here. So let's just dive into it. David's going to be doing our slide navigation. So David, you want to just take us to our next slide? So are you transaction ready as a seller? So what we're going to cover today is why these types of transactions happen, process to sell and divestiture, the types of potential buyers, key risks to the transition success, things to be aware of during the transaction, and then we'll conclude it with some next steps and questions.
That's great. Thank you, Jason. And first of all, and one of the things I'd like to say is as we're going along, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat feature, and we'll try to address them. Certainly at the end, we will have time. So please feel free to ask any questions you might have. Hopefully you have, in terms of our audience today, we're speaking primarily to HR professionals about ways to address the opportunity of a business sale and support that business sale. And these types of things can happen for any number of reasons. You're probably very familiar over the past few years with the divestitures that have been occurring at part of GE, and General Electric has, you can see, changed their strategic direction, trying to simplify the organization. One of the things they are also doing is raising cash. So an opportunity for a business to sell off part of their organization in order to raise cash, or to simply refocus and challenge the business. You're seeing that also recently with the announcement from Walmart that they're considering selling their Asda business in the UK. Other ways this happens, Chapter 11. Remington recently declared bankruptcy, and it was in the press recently that their ammunition business is being sold. Again, raising cash for the as part of that process.
Some of these companies, you don't even really know what their products are anymore. When you look at GE and somebody like HP, I mean, it literally looks like they've sold everything to raise cash. So, I mean, it's been a pretty intense focus for some of these people to raise cash and divest out of some businesses.
Absolutely. And, sometimes these transactions occur in smaller organizations that are looking for an exit for founders or for shareholders. So business may be underperformed, publicly traded business at times when the stock is underperforming, might look to be put up for sale in a way to provide value to shareholders. Privately held companies, sometimes the founder or the principal owner is looking for an exit, and that can be very small and very large companies as well. So a lot of different reasons for these transactions to happen. And, one of the things that, we would say, you'll see the last bullet point here, takes 2 times longer than planned. Very often, at least twice as long. So, one of the things that we would encourage everyone is to have patience as you go through a transaction. Deadlines and timelines are flexible and change quite frequently. As we talk about the process to sell or divest part of a company, one of the things that is important to understand as we think about this are different types of transactions, whether it is a stock sale or an asset sale within the organization, different types of buyers, financial buyers, strategic buyers, understanding the context of a potential transaction is very important, in part to understand how employees may be impacted by that transaction, as well as to understand what you as an HR professional may need to do in that transaction. No 2 transactions are the same, but generally as a timeline, we would say early stage is identifying potential buyers, a teaser or a confidential information memorandum often gets sent out. A buyer will submit a letter of intent outlining an amount they're willing to pay for that business, who would be receiving the funds for that business. These sorts of documents important in terms of the beginning stage of the process. We'll move into the data room, preparing the data room, particularly on the HR side, a lot of information that a buyer is going to ask for in terms of due diligence. And it's important here that you have a checklist of what information that you've provided, as well as a plan in terms of how you're going to share that information, not just mechanically, whether that's through a website or other means, but timing and sequencing that. Governance, understanding who will determine what information can be made available, what information is legally available, can be made available, can't be made available. And finally, meetings with prospective buyers and the opportunity to prepare documents to share with prospective buyers and really show off a business to its best features. And hopefully at the end of that process, you'll have a deal signed and you'll be ready to move into separation planning in the context of divesting a piece of a company. And you'll notice on top of the chevrons, we have announcement separate from deal signing and deal closing. It's not always the case, but often a deal will be signed confidentially and a public announcement won't occur until closer to or at the time of the deal close. Doesn't always happen, but often it does. And that can affect what information can be shared during the planning period. Other times an announcement's made immediately upon signing, and that helps with the communication.
Is there any rules of thumb about what people should be sharing and what people shouldn't be sharing during this time? Do you have any sort of takeaways about what that looks like?
Certainly one of the important elements would be remaining in compliance with applicable law, as it always is, certainly. But one of the things people don't often think about are issues around antitrust and also governance. So for example, during this time, the employees are still part of the original business. And so sharing information in some cases about those employees, certainly making decisions about those employees is something that you have to be very careful about allowing a buyer to be too involved in before the transaction is actually closed. That also relates to how you deal with customers, how you deal with vendors, and other relationships. So it's important to remember that you are still separate organizations, ongoing, and maintaining an arm's length relationship where possible.
That's great. Thank you.
So in terms of separation planning, one of the important elements is to understand who the employees are that are involved in the transaction. Identify them, make sure that there is agreement between the buyer and the seller. Transition plan, understand what the sequence of events will be for that transaction. Communications plan, and a strategy for the new organization and the remaining employee population. In terms of execution of that separation, we think about at times transition service agreements or TSAs, communication, and then how can we get both sides quick to productivity? How can we quickly return to productive environment on both sides, buyer and the seller? In green on the bottom, you'll see certain key documents, letter of intent, stock purchase agreement. These are also referred to sometimes as definitive agreements, executive contracts, due diligence reports, separation plans and a budget, communication strategy and plan, side-by-side analysis, new terms and conditions. Again, all documents and that you should be at least anticipating you may have to become involved in the preparation and drafting of. So as we talked earlier about divestitures, a sale, part of a business, and why those happen, we talked about some of the business reasons, but frequently it is because that unit is no longer considered core to the rest of the organization. And we talked about how those deals may be done. And again, the idea of a stock sale or an asset sale, a stock sale, really think about selling a legal entity. And with that sale of that legal entity, transfer of contracts, employment agreements, could be lease arrangements, could be all sorts of arrangements, and that business itself is going to go under new ownership. In an asset sale, you're really setting up the sale of parts of the business, and that may be intellectual property, there may be patents, there may be other things that are being sold, but the legal entity, and more importantly, in many cases, the liability is not transferring with that transaction. In those cases, most often employees will need to be provided with new offers of employment by the successor organization. The buyer will often need to provide new employment agreements, new offer letters, new documentation. Whereas in a stock sale, those employees should retain their existing employment agreement. And all of this can have a significant impact on what you as a seller need to do for employees, whether that's in terms of honoring contracts, severance agreements, compensation arrangements, and what a buyer may have to do. So as you'll see on the bottom, watch out. So be very careful about what contractually you may be obligated to provide to an employee under different types of transactions. carve-outs. Often as we think about a business, we may be thinking about a sale to the public markets. Siemens has done a number of these transactions. Their health organization, and most recently their energy business, where they have listed a unit publicly. And again, that can help generate cash. It can reduce capital constraints on the parent company, but it does create a whole new set of issues for that business. The expectations of that business, that leadership team, can be very different as a standalone or publicly traded organization. Is your leadership team ready to take on that responsibility, whether it is as a publicly traded business or under more often under private equity ownership? But thinking about how that impacts your leadership team is an important element to think about if you're undertaking this type of transaction. Very often, you may also be asked to pursue both types of exit simultaneously. And that, so in that case, you may be talking to buyers who are strategic buyers who might look to fold the business into their existing operations and would have infrastructure to support that. You may be talking to financial buyers who would need to set up the infrastructure for that business. And that in itself can create a lot of stress and challenges to the HR team involved. And move on to some of the key risks within to ensure success.
We're going to talk a little bit about the data room process. And David, and I think one of the things that we were talking about here, and oh my gosh, it's the coronavirus, which is literally ubiquitous with 2020. And I think that the coronavirus was put up here just to say that everything has gotten obviously a lot more complicated as it's related to deals. And one of the first things that we were talking about, and David and I were chatting even before this, was that at this time, it's good to just be careful with what kind of data you're putting in your data rooms, so that if there is some desire on behalf of competitors to be fishing around a little bit, you're not giving away the keys to the kingdom immediately in the data room. So, or, telling folks that you need to be, careful about what goes into the data room at this time. I think one of the things that we've been finding as it relates to data rooms lately is it's just taking a lot more effort to get things in there because everything is over Zoom. All of the conversations are video based, and things are taking, I think, a significant time longer to get populated, and people are being more careful with the data. So we're having to have, I think, more phone calls and more discussions and more emails to get those things into the data room, so that when we are getting to the point where the transaction is fairly far along and we feel like all parties are pretty serious, we're getting the appropriate data in there. David, you want to jump in and talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the data room process?
Sure. And, this is accelerating the move to virtual data rooms, I believe. We've seen that over the years. Those of us who've been doing deals for a long time remember going to attorneys' offices and sifting through boxes of documents, paper contracts, paper agreements. That all has been digitized in many cases for larger organizations, but even smaller organizations are having to shift to that more recently because of the challenges sharing information.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I actually touched a paper document as opposed to looking at a PDF. So it's been a long time.
It has. And one of the things here is, again, particularly in this environment where there are times when teams aren't gathering in the same way they used to, where people are remote, there are Zoom calls or emails. Tracking, particularly tracking the information you are sharing, the information you're being asked for, is very important. And being able to represent accurately what you shared, when you shared it, and address questions is helpful. And sometimes that information, feeding that information back to your deal team, can be very helpful, because it can help them understand what the prospective buyers are looking for, what they're interested in a way that they may not be aware of.
Anything else there that stands out, David? Or I think that's pretty clear about data rooms.
I think that's clear. I do think there are a couple, if you will, things to monitor. Remember, your executive contracts are going to be disclosed, but given the sensitive nature of those things, be mindful of when in the process that is shared. In addition, there will be, you will be disclosing information about prospective complaints and lawsuits from employees. Again, be mindful of when in the process you share that information. You're not seeking to hide that information, but it's important that it is at the appropriate time in the process.
Okay, ID team, which essentially is making sure that the team that is being acquired stays together as your buyer comes in and looks at your deal and wants to take your deal. I think that, we're looking at a time where, even though coronavirus has, impacted the job market and has, made things a little bit wonky out there, those people that have skill sets that companies are desirous of are still really important to retain and hard to retain. And we've got to realize that those skill sets that are important in technology organizations and healthcare organizations and other places, they are in demand. And no matter if we have a downturn in the economy right now, when things pick up, there's going to be a continued war for talent. And so with that, backdrop, we have to be able to retain the teams through deal close. We have to, make the buyer be able to answer what's in it for me as I move from this company to your company. Why should I stay there? What am I going to receive? What's better? Why is this good for my career? Everyone right now wants to be in a situation where it benefits their career, that they're learning and growing, and that they're being developed. I think those are all important things that you need to get answered for employees. Are they going to get new T's and C's? Benefits, obviously, a huge consideration right now as people are looking at benefits more than they ever have, especially with the impact of Corona. What is our bonus plans, current equity plans? Are you going to accelerate any vesting? How am I going to make money? How is this going to affect me and my family? And then what are the perks? Do perks get taken away? Are there better perks? I mean, obviously you don't want people to switch into a situation and they have takeaways. Never a positive in these types of situations where there's takeaways. And then you have to be prepared for those people that could potentially walk away. You want to have a plan in place before that happens, in terms of how do we save those people, and what does our plan look like even before that, of how do we keep people, moving from, our organization to the new organization. David, what would you add here?
I think some of the things, as you think about the team, certainly in the context of selling a part of your organization, understanding the buyer, so knowing whether they intend to retain, for example, support staff, HR, finance, legal. Will they need those employees or not? And how will that affect how you deal with it? thinking about that. Also, what is the financial impact of the sale? As Jason mentioned, in a startup, in the context of a startup organization, employees may have joined with an expectation that there will be a liquidity event, a wealth generating liquidity event in a business sale. But at times, and particularly in this environment, when businesses may not be performing as well, they may get acquired, and that stock the employees had may be worth nothing. And so that potential liquidity event may not be wealth generating. And how do you keep those employees engaged? How do you encourage them to remain with the new business to continue generating value? You really need to think about some of those things in advance if you realize that's a potential outcome.
And I'll tell you, when I've been in situations where the liquidity event that you were looking at does not generate any value, I can't put it any other way than it is like a kick in the gut. You just feel like your time was not well used and utilized. So it's a hard thing to overcome. So people really struggle with that. So I think that there's, a lot of things that you have to do to get people over that hurdle and make them feel better about the future related to that situation. All right, we'll go to the next one.
Yep, absolutely.
So announce equals target. So we talk a little here about talent acquisition. Do you have the right skills for separated organization, and how to attract talent to an organization in transition, which I think is always difficult. If you still need to hire while you're moving an organization to another company, it's always a challenge. I think that your management team, your talent acquisition team, and everyone else has to have a really good pitch and story about what's going to happen. I think you're not all aligned on that, and you don't have a good story to sell there. It makes it pretty challenging. And we talked about some of that in the last slide, the retention strategy. How do we get the current team to the close date? How do we get them, happy and keep them whole and keep them together until we close the deal? New team and how to drive the organization, in the future. Obviously, those things are going to look a little bit differently when they go into their new home. And then the thing that is, a struggle is the people that remain that didn't go. Obviously, they miss their friends. They wonder about the future of the organization that they're in terms of why did this happen? What is the company going to do with us? Are we successful? Are we on a good trajectory? So you immediately cause yourself some churn for those people that are staying, and them wondering about what does their future look like. So you have to do a really good job of getting those people who are potentially loose in the saddle stabilized moving forward. David, what would you like to add here?
Yeah, Jason, I'll just reemphasize that uncertainty that this sort of announcement brings to people. And that uncertainty, it's having been in that seat, right? That uncertainty is when you come home and your family members ask if you still have a job. It's when you are out with your friends and they wonder if you still have a job. It's important to be thinking about how you can retain those people. And that first bullet point, that uncertainty puts a target on your employees' back for potential other employers, right? Headhunters and will be calling. You should expect them to call. You should expect your top performers to be getting calls from other competitors. And so be aware of the impact that uncertainty has, and have a plan for how you can start to get beyond that sort of uncertainty.
I think right now over communication and there was a great segue is, we have to communicate very effectively, because what happens is in doing this, doing mergers and acquisitions and being in HR, you always learn very early that when people don't have the right information or they don't have a clear sense of what direction things are going, in the absence of information, they make things up, and which potentially aren't true. And I've learned a long time ago that the world hates a vacuum. So if there's a vacuum in anything, there's always something that comes in and sucks it up. And a lot of times there's inaccuracy that fills that vacuum. So, but David, you want to jump in here and take this on?
Great, thank you. And you know, that's absolutely right. The communication during this period is so critical. Um, and frankly, one of the things that I found very effective in communication is to tell people you don't know, to acknowledge their questions, and to, if you don't know, that is, to be upfront and say, we don't have an answer to that, but we're working on it, and provide that information. And one of the most important things to remember here is you will be partnering with the buyer. And no matter what the form of the transaction, again, these are still your employees. And however, the buyer is going to have a set of messages. And frankly, the buyer is going to have many of the answers to the employees' questions. So anticipate a challenging time when your employees have questions and you, as their employer, can't necessarily answer those questions. And, you know, as Jason said, nature bores a vacuum, and those, if you are not effective in terms of letting employees know that you're acknowledging their questions, you're trying to provide answers, they will make those answers up. And those could be as simple as benefits, they could be vacation days, they could be office location, but it's all very important in terms of how the employees are feeling about this event. Communication channels in this day and age, it's great. We have so many different mediums, email, websites, voicemail, all hands meetings, less prevalent these days. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to them. Slack, other team building channels. So using multiple channels. And, you know, one of the things with these is to maintain a Q&A or an FAQ, frequently asked questions, to share with employees questions you anticipate they will have and questions they are sharing. And so that if you get one question from an employee, you can assume that there are multiple employees with that same question. So that's a great way to reach a broader portion of your population. What's in it for me? Keeping your messages focused on the employees, what their needs are, what their concerns are, why the transaction will be helpful for them, which should help answer the questions why they should stay with the organization and whether or not they should take calls from other employers or recruiters about their future. And again, addressing some of those basic questions. How will this affect my pay? Will my salary be changed? And, you know, those are the types of questions that frequently you should be able to answer based on the definitive agreement, based on the terms of the sale agreement. Make sure you're sharing the information with the buyer so that you are not communicating unilaterally, but certain questions around compensation, their pay, the bonus, their stock awards, even questions. I've had issues come up in transactions about overtime, how one company views overtime versus another company, and employees concerned that if they're the way their overtime is treated will change. And that in particular outside the US can become an even bigger issue than here in the US. But state rules are different, and so it's important to think about the immediate impact to employees as they go through these types of things, and to have a plan to how to address them.
Don't mess with my OT. I know that one well.
And a post-close plan. So again, this is primarily assuming that you are selling a part of the business, and you will be there with the remaining business after the close of that sale. But it's going to impact, and this is another area where you'll be working with a buyer to develop a plan that will impact the employees who go to the new organization. How will jobs change? How will reporting lines change? Where will I report on my first day of work with the new employer? Or if the business is sold? Development, compensation again. All of these types of things are very important to address and plan for day one. And again, particularly if you've just exited a business, other employees in your organization are probably concerned that their business is going to be sold next. Or they may be in a functional area and worried about how that transaction is going to impact their future in your organization. So having a plan to address those sorts of issues ahead of time. Your priority is to stabilize the organization. And again, where you have to use a transition service agreement, you want to be prepared to support that for, frankly, ideally as short a period as possible, but however long is necessary to ensure the support of the ongoing business. And getting to transition service agreements or technical service agreements. These are contracts between the seller and the buyer to continue to support aspects of the business that has been sold for a period of time. And generally, these are important because certain things cannot be put in place immediately at day one. In some cases, this might include payroll. It might include benefits, again, from an HR perspective. It might include the HRIS system and data management. So it's important to understand what the buyer's capabilities are in terms of supporting the organization and being ready to go live on day one. And it's important to understand what you as a seller are able to provide them in terms of support. But remember, ultimately, you want that buyer to be self-sufficient as quickly as possible. So as you're thinking about these, the buyer may initially come up with a long list of services that they're interested in. You should think very hard about the pricing of those, about how you will exit them, about how you will agree on service levels. Because again, remember, you as the seller are becoming a vendor or service provider to that buying organization. And so understanding all of those issues is very important upfront. Jason, anything about TSAs that you want to add?
No, thank you. Summed it up very well.
Okay. The next slide, we just talked, for example, about pricing TSAs. And again, one of the things to think about, uh, most organizations think about, is how to price them in a way that will, frankly, discourage the buyer from being overly dependent upon them. Um, these become a distraction to your going forward business. And so you want to price them in a way that you are fairly compensated and appropriately compensated for the work you provide. But you also want to price them in a way that discourages the buyer from becoming dependent on them. And so you see things to consider as you're calculating that price. What is your current run rate cost of providing that service? Um, what is your fully loaded employee cost for delivering those services? What other costs do you have? Licenses, hardware, um, overhead around facilities, et cetera, services that you are providing, that you are incurring a cost for, and how can you price that, and then take that cost to you, and what premium, what is the cost plus in that arrangement. You'll see the example here on the right, where a buyer may be looking for recruiting support. And in this example, we have 3 recruiters at a salary of 150, at a fully loaded cost of 150,000 annually, additional IT and overhead costs. And so how do we think about that? We have all of those costs, and we calculate them for each of the 3 recruiters. And over that period of time, that 3-month period of time, and in this example, we would charge the buyer $45,750 for those services. And again, you should be specific in terms of the time, how long that service will be provided for, and what are the conditions of that service. So what are the service levels? What are response times? Those of you who are dealing with COEs and service centers are probably familiar with those sorts of service level agreements. But internal or HR organizations sometimes do not have them. And so it's important to think about how you would establish a service level agreement that you are comfortable living up to as you prepare that. And finally, just a few things to be aware of. We've identified 3 here, themes probably throughout our conversation: governance, communication, and plan for a moving target. Governance is an important feature within this type of transaction, both internal governance within your organization. Who are the decision makers? Who is owning the decision? How are you, and whether you have a formal RACI chart or not, how are you thinking about the steps you need to take? Documentation, how are decisions being documented? How is information that's being shared being documented? How is that maintained? So important elements around governance. External governance, right? We talked a little bit about some of the issues around things like antitrust issues. We talked about how you may need government approval in a transaction, and what does that look like? What does that allow you to do or prevent you from doing in the context of a transaction? So thinking about governance both internally and externally. Communication, we've I think Jason said it well. There really is no way to over communicate in this context. And remember that in your communications, you have multiple stakeholders. Your employee population is certainly a critical audience for your communication, but your investors are another critical. If it's a publicly traded company, the analysts on the street are critical. In your community you operate, understanding what the impact of a transaction is and speaking to that audience is very important. Again, your regulators, your vendors, your suppliers, all very important audiences. And finally, perhaps most important, is your customers. And remember that each of these audiences should have similar messages, because they will hear the messages intended for each other. So be careful that you don't send a message to your customers that's inconsistent with the message your employees receive, because that inconsistency will be identified very quickly. And even if your messages are consistent, be thoughtful about the timing of those messages and think about dependencies as you're putting together your plan. So for example, if your salespeople find out information about what will happen to their jobs from their customers, that's probably not an ideal strategy, right? So I think about the dependencies in communication as you're putting together those communication plans. And finally, plan for a moving target. Flexibility, adaptability, creativity, quite frankly, especially in this day and age, very important. And be patient as you think about things changing, whether those are delays between signing and closing, whether they are delays in the due diligence process getting to signing. You may have an issue where a prospective buyer needs to delay signing because their internal approvals can't be received because of everything else going on within the organization. So be flexible and accommodating and understand the need for changes. Jason, anything else on those?
No, I think plan for a moving target is definitely a very appropriate comment, especially with everything that's going on this year and just in general. Things always change. So I think you just have to be ready and flexible and just be able to, pivot on your heels as much as you can for any of these things.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And finally, Q&A. Again, please feel free, if you have any questions, to put them into the chat feature, and we'll try to address them. Annie will either read them out or share them. So please feel free, if anyone has any questions, let us know.
Hi, we have a couple of questions come through the chat. The first question is, what sort of non-financial retention initiatives have you seen?
Great, thank you. So non-financial retention, I think, is very important. I've worked with business leaders who, quite frankly, really were not interested in providing financial retention awards. And in many cases, buyers are concerned about financial retention awards because they may give employees an incentive not to remain with the new organization. So you need to be very thoughtful about that. Non-financial retention I would say focus on some of your core HR practices. What can you do to ensure that employees are engaged? And frankly, a lot of that happens with the first line manager. So do employees feel like their performance matters, that their performance is being appropriately measured? Do they feel like they are still being appropriately compensated, that they have appropriate promotional opportunities? All of the sorts of things that you would think about when you're trying to uh, maintain high engagement in a going forward business, think about in a business that is up for sale, and particularly areas around communication. So I think there is a risk sometimes, particularly um, in the context of a sale, to de-emphasize some of the core HR practices with a view that sometimes people will say things like, well, we're just going to have to do whatever the buyer says eventually anyway, so why should we keep doing this now? And, um, you know, although that, people are busy, the level of work goes up, there is a lot to do, but don't be tempted to de-emphasize those core HR practices because they will help keep employees involved and help keep employees engaged.
I mean, the future of work is about growth and development, and about how does my career continue to evolve? How do I get better with my skill sets? How do I maintain relevant skill sets as I get older? And how do the companies that I work for help me with that? So as much as you can make those things happen, either for the employees that are at your company or as they get moved over to the other company, and help that other company, either maintain a culture of growth and development, or you tell the other company and work with them about, creating a culture of growth and development. Because as we have seen, that this is one of the key drivers for employee satisfaction and employee engagement. So if you're able to get this one, knocked out, it'll be super critical, and it'll help you. Plus the communication piece is very critical. The more people feel communicated to and valued, and the more they see their skill sets being developed and them personally being taken care of, that will help a lot.
Great. Thank you. We do have another question.
Okay.
Do you do anything special to address employees not in the businesses being sold? And what concerns do they have?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you have to go to the employees that are not being sold. I think you have to go to them with your communication plan ready to go. I mean, you have to communicate to them through email. You have to communicate to them through an all hands, through videos. You have to tell them about why the business was sold, why the business is sold, what's the go forward strategy for the company that they're at right now. Look, we have too much transparency with everything in today's society, that if we lack transparency and the things that we do, we will not have an engaged workforce. So you have to have a strong communication plan back to those employees that stay, so that they understand the reasons and can walk away with a vision and a strategy about why certain things happened and potentially why this happened. So it's an absolute must that you have a really robust communication strategy and plan back to the people that are staying in the business.
I agree completely. And, I think part of that message also, remember, in many cases, the employees in that business that are being sold are friends or colleagues, acquaintances of the people who are remaining. And so in addition to their self-interest and their concern about what's happening to them, they're concerned about their friends and their colleagues, and they want to make sure that their employer is taking care of them, because frankly, they're going to be concerned if they don't think their employer takes care of their friends. Why are they going to take care of them? So
Yeah, that's well said.
trying to personalize these issues is very important as we go through it.
And do we have any other questions?
We do not at this time.
Fernando Herranz is out there and he doesn't have a question. Find that hard to believe. Okay. All right. If there's no, David, do you have anything else? Any other final comments?
No final comments. I want to thank everyone for joining, and there is a fourth session to this series coming up, and encourage everyone to join that. I listened to Alvarez and Marcel's presentation a week or so ago. Thought it was great, and want to thank Annie and the Rocky Mountain Total Rewards Association for having us, and Jason, you for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Excellent. Well, everybody have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. And the next one, the date on that one again is when?
October 15th. October 15th.
October 15th. All right. We'll look
And-
forward to seeing you again.
Great. And Jason, just one last thing, if I could, a sort of a shameless plug. On this slide, you'll see the website for Thrive HR Consulting, contact details for Jason, myself, and Ray Ramirez. And feel free to reach out, ask questions, and particularly if any of the documents we mentioned, data room checklist, transition services agreement, retention strategy, HR blueprint, if any of that would be helpful to you, please feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to being able to help you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Manny.
All right.